Hey, all right. We are back with another night of Cybersecurity Awareness Month, November edition. We're still talking about the SANS incident response cycle, and tonight we're going to talk about recovery. So, up until this point, everything we've done is really about understanding what's going on, some initial training in step one, right? Then identification of an event or an incident. Containment is, as we kind of talked about it, it's where we start isolating and limiting the damage an attacker can do. And eradication is really about kicking the bad guy out, frankly. So at this point, a ton of work has gone in, right? You've done an extensive amount of training with your team, hopefully, and that made the rest of the steps go smoother. You've really done your due diligence and scoped this event properly. And I can't express how important that scoping step is, right? If you scoped properly and then you did your containment and eradication, you are now ready for recovery. If you jump straight to recovery and you did not eradicate the bad guy and you did not contain because your scoping was off or you missed something, you're going to be repeating the whole cycle again, very likely. So it's really important that we're patient, that we make sure that we can actually confidently say we are now in a place where our network is free of bad guys and we can start bringing things back online like we need to. So, recovery is about getting things back to normal, right? It's when we start bringing machines online that were previously isolated, now that we're confirmed they're either safe or we've cleaned them. It's where we start restoring from backups from machines that we couldn't effectively and confidently clean up. It's maybe, I mean, as extensive as rebuilding entire domains, depending on the level of compromise, right? You're going through and you're resetting passwords. You are doing everything you need to do to bring your network back to the place it was before it was compromised. And most importantly, during this step, you really need to take the time to validate that the solutions you've put in place along the way are still working. So, one of the things we see is, you'll go to a server, you'll start investigating. As part of your containment, you might start patching during that eradication step. And then you realize that, hey, we actually need to restore some data because there was some data lost during the cleanup. And they revert to an old version of a server that doesn't have any of those fixes applied because it wasn't really documented while they were doing their eradication that they were applying these patches or these config changes. And then immediately you're back to a vulnerable system being your live system. So don't fall into that mistake. And that's really why things like documentation are critical. What steps did you take during eradication? What can't be undone as part of this recovery process, right? Did you make new firewall changes to block off traffic? Don't just restore to your old rule set. That old rule set, that old config, that old set of vulnerabilities is what got you in trouble. So make sure you're not putting yourself back in a vulnerable state just for the sake of recovery. Um, Good recovery can be tricky, right? So I want to spend the rest of this kind of session talking about planning to recover effectively. We do a lot of disaster recovery planning as being an MSP, right? So um, an effective recovery phase really starts with your backup and disaster recovery planning, and there's four real key areas you need to think about when you're doing this, and some of them are why people end up in trouble. Key decision one: what are you backing up? As you think through the idea of like a ransomware attack or a cyber intrusion of some sort, you need to be able to recover any data that you're legally obligated to via a framework, but also anything that would cost more to recreate than it does to back up. A lot of people think, hey, I don't really need to back that up. If I lost it, no big deal. Because maybe the data is recreatable, but you need to think about how much time it takes to recreate that data, both in labor hours, but also duration. Like, is that something you could genuinely recreate before the next time you needed it in a reasonable, work environment? You need to make sure that you're backing up things that you need to get your stuff back online, not just files. We see a lot of people who just go after cheap online file only backup solutions. And when it comes time to restore, it takes a lot longer because they then need to rebuild the systems from scratch to then restore the files to. And along with that, often they lose things like permissioning. They lose all those little details that make a file server secure to begin with. And we're right back into that weird state, right? Where now we're restoring stuff to an environment and it's vulnerable again. So make sure you're backing up complete system states. I mean, it's 2023. Whole disk images are usually what I recommend for most environments, especially in the SMB and commercial space. As you get larger into the large commercial enterprise space, sure, you need to start tiering off backups. You need to look at things like hot and cold storage. You need to look at archival processes. But If you're a small or medium business, especially, just back everything up and use a full and complete image backup like Veeam or something similar. Make sure you're also backing up your cloud hosted stuff. I hear it all the time. I don't need a backup of my Microsoft 365 things. Microsoft backs that up for me. Sort of. Get a backup, put it in a third party location. I tell people if your data isn't segregated and in a completely different location, it's not a backup. You need a copy of your data that is free and clear of the environment that could be compromised if you want to be protected. You need an immutable backup. So, cloud based stuff, get a backup, get it into a third party provider. There's a lot of them out there. On premise stuff, get it into a cloud based data center, get it out of the location, right? And make sure you're backing up everything that you need, not just stuff that looks convenient. Recovery point objective. So the key decision number 2 is how often do you need to back up your data? Everybody's like, what do you mean? I'll back it up once a day, I'm good to go. That may or may not be sufficient. So recovery point objective is the frequency you're taking backups. And what that means is if you are a business who makes changes to your data a lot, right? Say you work in an environment where you're taking a lot of transactional data in, you're working with, say you're Amazon, right? Thousands and millions of transactions a minute, probably. Not having a backup or only taking a backup once a day means that if you need to recover from that backup, you've lost an entire day's worth of transactions. If you're a very small organization or an organization that doesn't change things a lot, maybe one day of lost work isn't a big deal. If you're a huge organization or you're a very, very fast transactional organization, or even if the transactions are just so high value that they can't be lost, you need to start looking at backups that are running more frequently. I've worked with organizations where we're backing up as frequently as every 15 minutes, and I've worked with organizations where the data really only needs to be backed up daily or even weekly in some cases for archival data. But understand what duration of backup you need to run and what the impact of your business is if you lose that data, because that's ultimately the decision you're making. Is if you're running a backup once a day, what you're saying is you're okay with losing one full day's of productivity with your organization. And that is the worst case, right? Like you'll lose a day's worth of data. If you think if you can recover and you're losing the day's worth of data and you can just rebuild that stuff and you're good to go, that's fine. It is cheaper to back up less frequently. But if losing a whole day's worth of productivity is an expensive thing for you or puts you at risk as a business, you need to back up more frequently. So recovery time objective or recovery point objective is what you're after here. Key decision 3, and this is the one that I think people find out when it's too late, especially during ransomware attacks. There's been a lot of times where people thought they had good backups, and they did. They had a great backup. It was there. It was safe. It was secure. The backup was offsite. All the things that they're told to do, but they can't restore it in a timely manner because it's a lot of data that needs to be re-downloaded. The tool is just really slow to write. The infrastructure doesn't write enough. They don't have a process for getting it all. They didn't spend the time to prioritize what order to do things in. They don't know what the dependencies in data are. So understand your recovery time objective. You need to figure out how long your business can survive without that data, right? If you're saying that your business can only be offline for 8 hours and you have a backup solution that takes 24 hours to get all your things back, you have a problem. It doesn't matter at that point that you have backups of all your data if you can't restore it to a state that you need it in. So, recovery time objective is the duration of time that functionality must be restored to avoid unacceptable consequences for your business, right? If you're working in a time sensitive industry, and we've seen this, right? Doctors' offices, they need to know what appointments are coming up, what medication schedules patients are on. They need that data back fast. They can't wait a week for that kind of stuff to come back online typically. Law offices, CPA firms, right? And you have to think about it in the context of some of the worst case scenarios. If you're a CPA firm and you're in, I don't know, May, June, July, yeah, you don't want to lose data, but if your firm's down for, a few days as you recover data, it's probably not the end of the world if we're sitting in mid-July. If it's April 12th, you're probably not having a good time, right? If it's right before October 15th when all extensions are due, you're probably not having a good time. So understand that your recovery time objective is how long you can be without your data while you wait for it to restore. And as part of this planning, make sure you take the time to plan out what data is most critical to restore and what the dependencies of that data is. You might say, I don't need all of my data back within 8 hours, but I need this subset of data back within 8 hours. You have to document that and plan for those kinds of things. So understand what your recovery time objective is and make sure that the solution you're buying and you're implementing meets that. For a lot of people, this might mean a multi-tiered solution. You might have an on-premise backup solution for that quick recovery time objective because you need that data back quickly. You need to be able to have it. And then you also replicate that offsite, right? The offsite version, if you're in Hawaii, like a lot of my clients are, hurricane comes through, everybody's in kind of a little bit of trouble. That means you probably don't need to be back online that day unless you're in some type of emergency services group. But you have a couple days because everybody's offline, so you can take the time to restore from that cloud-based kind of solution. But if you're in one of those situations where it's ransomware or something, you want that on-site copy to come back real quick. So recovery time objective is your third decision point. And the fourth decision that you need to make is how long are you keeping that data for? And this gets really critical for a couple of reasons. One, from a compliance perspective, you're just obligated to keep data for a certain period of time, depending on the compliance framework. So first and foremost, follow that. But secondly, from a security perspective, the average time to detect for a lot of breaches is well over 200 days. I want to say the most recent report I saw was like 250 days even. So that means that when we start thinking through those four puzzle pieces, right, that initial access and initial compromise date, that could have been 200 days ago. That could have been hundreds of days where a bad guy had access to your network, where they were planting persistence methods, where they were snooping around and doing stuff that you just weren't aware of it. If you want to be able to recover to a point that was pre breach, you have to have enough data to do that. Attackers do move quickly. I'm not going to say every attack is somebody sitting on the network and kind of soaking in for 200 days. There are absolutely attackers that drop in ransomware their stuff and you're gone. Maybe 7 days worth of backups is good at that point. I don't think so though. I think if you're not backing up and retaining for at least a year, you have a lot of risk you're absorbing there. I mean, a year's worth of backup seems like a lot, but it's really not, especially when you think about stats like this, where time to detect in a lot of environments is measured in months. It's not measured in days, and you need to be able to recover before that. You want to be able to go back and see if something existed prior to that date. You want to go back and look at, old versions of things to see what happened. It's also really important in environments where you might not touch that data often. Going back to like the CPA scenario, right? If we're talking about a CPA firm that's very cyclical in what they do, they get all the tax paperwork for some of their clients, especially if they're doing tax prep predominantly. Once those taxes are filed, they might put that stuff away for months for that particular client, right? While they move on to other clients and other activities. If you don't notice that data is missing or changed until next year when you're ready to do their taxes again and you're only keeping a couple weeks worth of backups, you can't recover it. And accidental data loss is just as much of a risk, if not larger, than things like cyber attacks. So we're talking about this stuff in the context of a cyber attack, but understand that these same plans are there to protect you from all kinds of data loss. So think about that retention period. How long would it take you to know the data is bad, missing, broken, and that you need to recover? How long can you go without that data? And how much data are you willing to lose during the recovery period? And make sure all these things kind of align when you're talking about your recovery strategy. Otherwise, when you get to this phase, you're going to find yourself in that position where you did the work, you did the identification, the scoping, the containment, you were able to get rid of the bad guy, but you still can't recover your data, so you're going to pay that ransom anyway. Right? And no one wants to be in that position where you have the data, it's sitting there on a drive somewhere in the cloud, and you just can't restore it in time because your business needs to be online. Make sure you're answering those questions as you plan your recovery phases. And that's kind of tonight's lesson. Final session in our incident response cycle mini series will be lessons learned and some communication tips and things like that, probably. So come back for the next video. Have a great night and welcome to November edition of Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Thanks, everybody.